Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Tim Hennessy. I'm the Director of Managed Services at NovaCoast. We are very happy to have you all here today. I have on the line with me today Larry Stein, who's one of the Directors of Security Services at NovaCoast, and Scott Savinelli, who is one of our senior engineers and also an expert on vulnerability management and process. So I'm going to give you a very quick, short overview of NovaCoast, and we're going to jump right into the webinar. So Scott, if you could go ahead and flip to the next slide. All right, so NovaCoast is a professional services group. We've been in business for 20 years. We really have a narrow focus on working with groups on security. We do all things security and compliance, assessments. We help groups to integrate security solutions. We work with a variety of security solutions, but really help you to build those defenses and get the most out of those. We also help groups with their identity and access management strategies. And in addition to that, we do have a development group to create custom automation, custom connectors, and things of that nature. And then our managed services is an operate piece of it. So we tend to kind of look at things from a program perspective and people and process, and we do have a build, operate, transfer methodology in everything that we do. So we have a short poll question that we've prepared, and the idea is, do you have a vulnerability management program today? So if everyone could just click that, we'll show the results here in a minute, but this is what I would consider a solution for managing it. So great, looks like about 50-50 so far. Let a few more people click in there. All right, so looks like it's split for groups that do have it and groups that do not have it. Second question is, do you have a scanner or a vulnerability management solution? So are you currently working with a tool, or are you looking to get a new tool? So. All right. Give everyone else a couple more minutes. So it does look like most people do have a scanner, and people are 50-50 on their program. So we're going to talk a lot about program today. So that's what I have for you so far. I'm going to let Scott Savinelli take over. So Scott, go take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Tim. Like Tim said, my name is Scott Savinelli, and I'm an engineer here at NovaCoast, and I do focus on other things, but more specifically vulnerability management. And today we're going to get in the weeds a little bit on that. So just to kick off, as I'm sure all of you guys know, vulnerability management very generally is just sort of that repeatable process that we go through of identifying, classifying, remediating, and mitigating hardware and software vulnerabilities. But there have been significant changes in the threat landscape, and that's kind of thrust vulnerability management more into the spotlight as a very necessary component of any organization's cybersecurity strategy. So let's just get in, and we'll with the situation, and we'll get a lay of the land. So first off, let's take a look at the network landscape. Sorry about that. So obviously, it's pretty much a reality that in any organization that our network environments are evolving. Looking at the bottom there, we have our traditional IT assets, our desktops, our servers, our network devices. But as scalability and innovation opportunities are afforded to us vis-a-vis the cloud, DevOps, IoT, OT devices, the impact of that is just an ever-expanding and very dynamic attack surface. And so most often in my experience with customers, a lot of times people will struggle even to keep track of their traditional IT assets. So one of the big questions is how are your InfoSec and security teams dealing with that growing attack surface and the expanding network landscape? Oh, next. And now let's just add to that the second component of this, and that's the vulnerability landscape. So on the previous slide, we're looking at assets, and we're looking at a growing dynamic environment when you include public-private cloud, IoT, OT, ICS devices, you're virtualizing in your environment, different initiatives. And that growing attack surface simply means there's going to be a significant increase in vulnerabilities, which the trending shows. As simply put, the adversaries have a much larger attack surface to probe and exploit. So more or less the bottom line is increased exposure equals increased attack vectors, and that equals increased risk. So let's analyze that landscape a little bit further and drill down. So now I'm sure everybody, it's come up in some vulnerability management discussion. You've heard the cliche, you can't fix what you can't see. And what that really boils down to is the necessity of visibility. And a lot of times, we kind of ride roughshod over that point, thinking about, can I see all my assets? Now, that is important, but what do we really mean by that? So on the asset front, yeah, can you see all the assets on your network? If so, do you know what services they're hosting? Are there any services dependent on those assets? How important are they to your business operations? How vulnerable are they? How exposed are they? Are any of those assets publicly accessible? Do any of them contain sensitive data? And then moving in on the vulnerability front, are you guys confident that you're identifying all the vulnerabilities on your network? Do you know if exploits exist for those vulnerabilities? Can they be exploited remotely, physically? Like, do they require local access? Do they open you up to lateral movement? Those are just a few, kind of off the top of your head, questions that your IT security teams need to be asking themselves in order to sort of understand your cyber risk in its entirety. We'll just move on. So let's summarize the challenge that we're faced with. I'll let you guys read the Sisyphus slide, but so on the one hand, we have the attack surface, our assets. Here, there's a reason, regardless of what security standard you're using as a benchmark, whether it's CIS, NIST, ISO, there's a reason that the top two primary controls have and always have been hardware and software inventory. It's critical you know what's on your network. So, I mean, a question to you guys to sort of ponder in the background: how well does your organization identify, characterize, track, and prioritize your traditional and also your non-traditional IT assets? Do you guys feel like you're keeping pace with any digital initiatives that your organization is implementing? And perhaps most importantly, do you have a source of truth, CMDB, that you're constantly updating and feeding to make sure that inventory is as accurate as possible? And now overlay that with the vulnerability side of the house. How are you scanning for vulnerabilities and misconfigurations? And whatever tool you're using, I notice almost all of you have one or answered yes to that question. Do you feel like you can keep that tool is satisfying your requirements and keeping pace with the growing threat landscape? And then last, but equally important, is what are you doing with that data that you're generating from your tool? How are you reporting? How are you remediating? And how are you tracking progress for your management? So sort of in conclusion here, just to summarize this, what we really want to do is we're looking to create an accurate asset inventory. We want to merge that with vulnerability data and then translate that into a prioritized remediation strategy that addresses our risk and minimizes our business impact of any potential exploit. So with that, we'll talk about our approach. And just want to throw just a quick quote to put that, how we put that in perspective. Just to add a little context to this, I was a Marine for 10 years before I took off the uniform and moved over to the NSA and then later on to another government organization. But while I was in uniform, I had the privilege of serving under then General Mass Secretary Mattis when he was the commanding officer of the United States Central Command, which covers the Middle East and North African area of operations. So while I was forward on deployments, I had the opportunity to brief him. And the notion of strategy and not only a well-defined strategy, but a well-communicated strategy was paramount. And he insisted on the fact that it was paramount in all of what we call the domains of warfare. So obviously people are familiar with land, sea, air, and then you add on space as a sort of battlefront, but certainly cyberspace. And, you know, we spoke about tools, and then we asked you another question about program. Tools are important, but tools employed without a strategy have little impact, if any. So bearing that in mind, we'll move on to how we at NovaCoast like to approach this problem. So the three critical areas: people, processes, and tools. So addressing the challenge we had on the previous slide, it's an investment. VM is an investment of time and resources. And what we like to do at NovaCoast is try and focus that investment on the fundamentals of asset, vulnerability, and patch management, the people and the processes component of the program. We can certainly make recommendations per your request for a tool, but ultimately we're tool agnostic. What we really strive to do is help a customer address risk in its entirety by taking a data set, knowing what to look for, why you're looking for it, and giving it context in your environment and to your business, prioritizing and remediating accordingly, and then being able to repeat that process. So very much it's process-driven, vice tool-driven with regard to the approach. And ultimately, you know, the idea being is that a tool, let's say in this case a vulnerability scanner, it'll give you a list of vulnerabilities, but ultimately it's not going to tell you which one of those vulnerabilities is the biggest risk to your organization. One more thing before I move on, just to circle back to the previous slide and maybe give General Mattis's words a little bit more context and how we incorporate that into our approach to VM. We talked before, or I mentioned visibility and the necessity of it. Well, one thing to overlay to all this is the importance of communication as a facilitator of visibility. So kind of what do I mean by that? So part of this process is communication between all IT stakeholders in your organization to ensure that the processes, the policies are enterprise-wide, and all of the people associated are incorporated and fall within that umbrella. So, you know, ensuring that everyone has input, everyone has buy-in and understands their roles and responsibilities. So, like I said, echoing General Mattis, we talk a lot about, you know, responsibilities. So a successful program, it's the responsibility of the analysts, the engineers like myself, to provide accurate and actionable intelligence to the decision makers, the C-level executives. In turn, in order for them to make informed decisions, and they in turn they're responsible for drafting a strategy in the form of policy so that guys like myself and probably a lot of you on this call can execute it with the tools at our disposal. So just when we're talking about people and processes, just remember that those things don't necessarily exist in a vacuum. Like, they're interconnected and they require good flows of communication. So let's start breaking this down. As I said before, what are our objectives? They're right there on the left. And then again, communication doesn't exist in a vacuum, and these core disciplines don't exist in a vacuum. They're all interconnected if you truly want to identify and address risk in your organization. And that's what we try to do. We look at these three core disciplines in their entirety. We draft processes that are interconnected. And certainly when we engage a customer, we're looking to identify gaps, whether they're most often in the people and process side or where we find them, that are sort of hindering customers in addressing their pain points with vulnerability management and kind of hindering them from building upon these foundational principles. And that moves us down, again, continuing to drill down here. So more or less, I'll let these three key questions sort of sit on their own while I talk to them. But these are pretty much three key questions that any sort of CISO or C-level exec should be able to answer for their organization. Sort of moving from left to right. How exposed are you, or how secure are you? So what does that entail? That requires visibility into all aspects of your attack surface, and taking inventory of where the real threats to your company exist. So the sooner all of those are on your InfoSec team radar and you come to terms with where your exposures are or potentially can be, that's when you're starting to identify at the big picture level what's actually at risk. Prioritization, another key. The answer here is a combination of threat intel to understand the exploitability of the issue and the asset criticality, the criticality of the system affected in order to put that in a business context. And it's absolutely critical to prioritize vulnerabilities with respect to business context in order to optimize your effort, your resources, your budget, personnel, etc. This more or less just enables you to focus your attention on protecting the vulnerable areas that are likely to cost you, whether it's a labor cost, a regulatory penalty, data recovery, whatever. And then lastly, benchmarking, progress tracking. How are you doing over time? You need the ability to gauge your process, and the only way to do that is to identify and clearly define metrics and KPIs against which you can measure your efforts. You should be able to view those metrics however you slice up your organization, whether it's by business unit, geographical location, asset type, etc. And the ultimate goal is to sort of understand your exposure profile, I guess is a good way to say it, and how it changes from month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. And that way you can help those business decision makers and C-level executives understand, one, whether your investments in security are coming to fruition, and two, you can analyze and refine your process, find out what's working, where you can tweak it, and how to make it better. Going a little further, what is that real risk that we're talking about? And this is about as boiled down as you can get it. In the upper left-hand corner, the threat severity, we're focused here on the vulnerability side. The other three, we're talking about assets. And again, we're overlaying the two to more or less determine, when we say real risk, we're saying, what are the most critical vulnerabilities that affect my most critical assets and put me at the greatest risk of something happening and affecting business operations? Probably the only simpler way I could really break this slide down is just to think of it as, what's my risk? Well, it's going to be the ease of exploitation of a vulnerability and the impact of that exploitation, and that certainly is an asset question. If this happens, well, one, how probable and how easy is it for it to happen? And if it hits one of my crown jewels, a protected system, what's the potential cost? That's the risk we're looking to identify and mitigate. So how are we going to do that? And we'll get into the process. Very quickly, I'm sure you guys have seen a cycle very similar to this with respect to vulnerability management. Obviously, everything hinges on discovery or identification. You'll see it in other models. You have to know, and you have to be able to know and identify every asset on your network. That is to say, anything that's potentially vulnerable. And discovery is a continuous process, as especially with virtual instances, cloud instances being spun up, torn down, mobile devices constantly connecting and disconnecting from your network. It's a landscape that changes often, and every time it changes, it has an impact on what we'd call your attack surface. And then obviously after discovery is assessment, characterizing those assets. What's their configuration status? What vulnerabilities are affecting them? Do they need to be compliant with a particular regulatory standard? Then we analyze those, and we put together a remediation plan that focuses on the vulnerabilities, but more importantly, the vulnerabilities that are affecting those assets that are most critical. Then we move to fix or remediate. And then, of course, as we said, we need to measure. Measurement, you can certainly look at twofold. I certainly think it's twofold. One, we need to validate the patches and sort of compensating controls that our security teams have implemented to make sure that we secured the vulnerabilities we intended to, and also so that we can report to C-level management and decision makers to show them the overall progress of the program and ensure they're getting a return on their investment. And then we move on into maturity. So first, just as a quick synopsis of what we've been looking at, we'll go back to our landscape. And as we've been saying, a couple things to highlight here. One is just the interconnectedness of these disciplines. At the bottom, you look at, that was our initial challenge. We want to minimize risk. Well, what does that entail? We have vulnerability management, we have asset management, we have patch management, and then sort of the follow-on actions that pertain to those. Like I said before, nothing exists in a vacuum, and this illustrates that. So kind of to highlight that, you have a vulnerability management tool, you have a scanner, you might have one or two subject matter experts familiar with that tool. Same thing on, say you have, you do have a good CMDB and you have personnel devoted to maintaining that. Patch management tool, same thing. How well are those teams and those tools integrated? How well are they communicating? How good are the workflows that you have for reporting to different consumers of that information throughout your organization? None of those processes are standalone, and none of them are directly contingent on what kind of tool you have employed. If those processes aren't in place, and if the personnel responsible for them don't have clearly defined policies to execute and means of communicating the resultant data, overall, you're not going to succeed in identifying, let alone reducing risk. And then just one more thing, I said it again, but the other thing to overlay on this slide is, I'll just echo it, it's just that notion of a unified security strategy. That really is the only way to avoid compartmentalization of tools and personnel. Incorporate all your stakeholders, which is certainly a guarantor of success, and then really stresses visibility as an inclusive concept. So wrapping up, just a sample maturity model, and I'll let you guys obviously look at this, kind of place yourselves based on how you see your program to date, and just say that, in our eyes at Nova Coast, it really doesn't matter where you are on this continuum. Everyone's going to be somewhere. People who might not have a tool, people who might feel they're pretty far along and pretty vulnerability management savvy. But there's always room for improvement. And no one, everyone can sometimes use an assessment. Take a look, identify where you are, identify the gaps, whether it's a tooling gap, a gap in processes or policy, or maybe a personnel gap. Where are you struggling? Identify the pain points, and then kind of define requirements and objectives. Where are you now? Where do you want to be? Where do you need to be? And that way, like I said, regardless of where you are in the continuum, we can identify that place and put together a plan that can take you forward. And then last but not least, before I turn it back over to Tim, just to tie up everything we're saying, I'm sure everyone who joined us today is familiar with the newest version of the CIS critical security controls. If you guys were familiar with version 6, they're actually exactly the same, with a couple changes. And one of which is the ordering. For those of you who remember, vulnerability management used to be control number 4. It's now number 3. And another change was the way they sort of broke them down. Not only the ordering, but the 3 functional categories. One of the biggest reasons for this was for the update was to reflect the current threat landscape. And you look at that leftmost column, and more specifically at the top 3, there really is no way around it. You have to know your hardware, you have to know your software, and you have to continuously be looking for the vulnerabilities that affect them, prioritizing those, and then mitigating them. It's the most basic foundation, the most core disciplines to expand on any cybersecurity program. A lot of times we'll come on site with a customer. As you look across these 20, they'll have a DLP solution. They may have engaged someone to conduct a pen test. They'll have an endpoint protection tool installed. They have AV. They might even have a threat hunting team. But really, at some point, all of those disciplines and any conversations you have about them, it's going to circle back to how well you know your network, what's on it, hardware and software, and what is it vulnerable to. That really is the key to identifying risk and having any chance of mitigating it. So with that, I just want to thank you guys for your attention and for showing up, and I will turn it back over to Tim. Feel free to ask questions or, follow up. Thanks a lot. Tim?
Yep, very good. So just to kind of cap off a little bit of this, we have 4 24/7 SOCs. They all run independently, and the core of how we break out all of our managed service offering is that we handle 100% of the care and feeding. The analysts will do a lot of the work that Scott talked about with the maturity and where we can assist in setting up your scanner and helping you to interpret those results. But we're always looking to improve a group by maturing them for wherever they sit today to where they need to be and where they're trying to go. So this is the core of how we're built, and we do have a UK SOC, we have a South American SOC, and we have 2 in the US. We offer this co-managed model for several different types of areas: identity and access management, SIM solutions, EDR, firewalls, data loss prevention. We also do incident response retainers. So just wanted to kind of leave you with that we're a group that is all about building program and process, and we've built a business around doing that in the security space. So with that, is there any questions for Scott Savinelli or Larry Stein on the line?
We have one question here about the slides. So we'll send out the recording after this, and we'll make sure to do that. And then also, if in this situation, if you're not prepared with a question, we'll make sure to follow up with everyone, and you can answer. We can answer any questions through that dialogue as well.
Yep, and happy to do one-on-one assessments of your environment. We can do kind of initial discussion at of course, no cost.
Yeah, we also have a little document as well that kind of covers some of the vulnerability management side of things that we'll make sure you guys get as well.
Great. Well, if there's no further questions, thank you again for your time. Thank you, Scott, and we will hope to talk to you all soon. Have a great week.
Actually, 1 second. There's one question on the ISC squared number. You can just put it in the chat box right now. Before we hang up. And then one more was about, what about companies that use legacy systems and want to migrate? Where does that one start?
I'm sorry, I've been trying to keep track of the questions as they pop through there. In terms of helping out someone who, like you said, you have legacy systems that you're either looking to decom and migrate. That's certainly a discussion we can have. Putting together that like a sort of end of life program or helping people. If you're making infrastructure changes or migrating to the cloud, virtualizing, we could certainly have that discussion. I don't know if we could knock it out right here, but yeah, feel free to reach out, and there's certainly, like I said, there's a lot to discuss in that space. So feel free to reach out, and certainly doing a risk assessment to a migration project, what that might look like potentially for your organization. We'd certainly take that up offline in a follow up.
Yeah, and David will again. David will follow up with you on the slide deck as well. So no problem there. All right. I think that should do it. Well, thank you, Scott and Tim and Larry for the presentation, and to everyone else, have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.